Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.
Well, it's good to be here today. I'm really excited to talk on this subject for those of you that haven't had a chance to really delve into cryptocurrency and how it's going to impact this space. Hopefully it's fairly enlightening. Quick survey of the crowd before we begin so I have an idea. How many people would say they're fairly familiar with Bitcoin right now? So about around half the audience, so sounds like most people are fairly savvy. And I'm going to talk today in the context of the API network, which is an open source protocol whose board of directors that I sit on of a nonprofit foundation that encourages the development of this and essentially taking the advantages of cryptocurrency and opening that up for the API space. So why don't we go ahead and just jump right in. Really the goal of this protocol is to create a marketplace for APIs, a decentralized marketplace where any service provider, any API provider can offer their API to the marketplace and make it available in a way that really removes a lot of the existing barriers today. As we all know, there's a ton of friction in signing up for a subscription, getting customers to make payments, and really using some of these technologies to remove those barriers. So, for instance, we're all familiar with the fees involved in credit card processing and these other technologies. With Bitcoin, we can essentially remove that friction. So, quick background on this. Bitcoin, in a lot of ways, is a self-clearing payment mechanism. So by setting up a Bitcoin account, people can pay directly from person to person, much the same way you can email from one email address to another email address. Now you have a Bitcoin address, you can easily send value from that Bitcoin address to any other Bitcoin address. And this can be done without, needing permission or setting up with any central authority. You can do this rather directly from person to person, which is great because now essentially this gives you programmable money. You can enable any program or API to interact with the Bitcoin network and move money around in a pretty frictionless way. Now, a lot of people often ask about, well, I don't necessarily want to take the currency risk of holding Bitcoin. I see the price goes up and down. Well, that's sort of where a lot of services like BitPay enter the picture and remove the currency risk for merchants, or in this case, API providers that are accepting Bitcoin. They can immediately turn around and take the Bitcoin that you've created or that you've accepted and trade it for whatever fiat currency you want, dollars or euros or pounds or whatever. So in this way, you can access sort of all the benefits of accepting Bitcoin from users around the world, but not have to take any of the currency risk involved in that. So that's sort of something that's very helpful. Now, this is a white paper that I wrote at the end of last year that sort of explores this idea of Bitcoin as a generalized model for developing new technology. So we're terming these applications decentralized applications. And this is essentially going beyond just taking Bitcoin, but really thinking of Bitcoin as a monetization model going forward. So if you think about the four things that have really made Bitcoin successful, the first is the fact that it's an open source protocol. A lot of people in this room might take that for granted at this point, but by not having a proprietary standard, by having something open that anybody could build on top of, it made Bitcoin a real powerhouse for people being able to innovate on top of the platform. The second thing is the fact that Bitcoin is fully decentralized. There's no central point of failure. You had all of the records of Bitcoin on all of the nodes and all of the software that everybody that ran the software had a copy of all the transactions. And so this has created a really robust system where you're not counting on some central server to hold the records. Everybody has a copy of the records. The third aspect that I want to talk about is the fact that Bitcoin is automated in its consensus mechanism. So in Bitcoin, there's what's called the proof of work, where any node can add computational power to the network and essentially increase the security of the network and confirm the transactions on the network. And this is a really powerful concept because it really opened it up for people to compete to provide this service and to confirm the transactions on the network. This is actually how Bitcoins are generated. People are finding 25 new Bitcoins every 10 minutes or so as part of a block reward for providing security and hashing power to the network. So this consensus mechanism, which allows for all the nodes to essentially agree on the same state of where Bitcoin is, how much amount is in every account, if you will, really created this powerful system where it's unleashed people to build hundreds of millions of dollars worth of mining hardware that does nothing but secure the Bitcoin network. This is part of why it's become so powerful, become so widely used. The fourth aspect, in addition to being open source, in addition to being decentralized and automating the way that it sends value around the network or rewards people for contributing to the network, is the monetization through a token. Now, instead of building in fees, instead of building in a system where there was a Red Hat or something charging services on top, Bitcoin is essentially the first open source project that is monetizing directly through the use of the software itself. So to say that in a different way, in order to use Bitcoin, you need to have the Bitcoin token. And so because there's a limited number of Bitcoin tokens that will ever exist, this essentially creates a situation where as more and more people use the Bitcoin network, you're increasing organic demand for these tokens. And because there's a limited number, the value of the token is increasing proportionate based on the new people adopting this system. So what I proposed in this white paper at the end of last year is that this isn't an anomaly. This isn't just some freak accident where Bitcoin became a $5 billion ecosystem in 5 years without a CEO and without a formal staff. I'm proposing that this is actually a model we can use going forward to build all sorts of new different types of technology. So I want to talk about one project in particular today that's using this model and applying it to the API space. So that is the API network. So the idea with the API network is it's emulating this same model of Bitcoin. It's an open source protocol that anybody can use and anybody can build on top of. It has its own token, the API coin, which is used internally for its own marketplace. So if people want to access the APIs on the API network, then they use some API coins to do that. There's a limited number of those API coins. It has a consensus mechanism built into its billing module where it's keeping track of how often the APIs are accessed and essentially providing that as a service to the API providers, keeping track of all of the calls to the APIs and essentially automating that process of making payments to APIs through people using the service and so forth. And it's completely decentralized where all of these records are uploaded to a decentralized data system where they're stored and made available. And it's federated in the sense that anybody can provide these APIs and everybody can compete to provide these different data sources. So let's take an example of Facebook. If somebody offered API for Facebook, you could essentially have lots of people competing to provide that common API, and you could have market competition and price competition for something like that. So here's the pain points that they're really trying to resolve. Obviously, the current state of APIs is that we have centralized entities providing this data. People, have to get involved and have a custom interface for a lot of each of these different APIs. Developers have to make individual agreements with everybody they're providing, get them signed up through their custom subscription agreements, and it sort of limits, I think, the potential and scale of APIs today. So the vision for the API network is to remove those pain points and really make it so people can provide their APIs directly to the market in a uniform way that makes it extremely easy for somebody to just sign up on this single market and access a ton of different APIs. For them to do so without having to create a subscription for particular APIs, but everybody on this network can accept API coins as the common unit of currency within this network. And it really, I think, creates a position where we can remove a lot of these pain points. So I want to walk through a particular use case, invite our friends Alice and Bob to join us today and walk through what this would actually look like in the real world. So let's take the example of Alice. And Alice has a Bitcoin to Dogecoin exchange website. So this is where people trade Bitcoin for Dogecoin cryptocurrencies. And her website shows the price of Bitcoin to Dogecoin. So she has all the data for that particular market. Bob has a coin chart website with the prices of lots of different cryptocurrencies for Bitcoin and a lot of other coins. Now, Bob wants to add the price of Bitcoin to Dogecoin to his charts. But as we all know, that normally isn't easy. First, Bob has to find where the data is, has to connect to that particular API that provides the data for his charts. And if the data provider at any time changes their API, it essentially breaks his service and he has to go find another data source or update his data source. Now, lucky for Bob, Alice has listed her price data on the API network. And so all Bob has to do is find her data available on the API network, and he can quickly connect it to his website. Now, in no time, Bob has beautiful charts on his website, and Alice is getting API coins providing that data. Now, the big goal here is to align incentives. I think the point was really importantly made in another of the earlier sessions yesterday, that this whole market is really moving towards a much more granular approach, where we'd all like to be able to do microtransactions, to have lots more people be able to access the data, and to be compensated directly for that with a lot more ease. This also sort of gives Alice, as the provider of this data, a direct monetary incentive for her to make that data available. If it ever changes, for her to update the way that people can access it. A lot of times I find in this industry, the API provider and the person accessing the API are often at odds, right? So take Twitter as an example. I remember the early days of Twitter when the whole ecosystem was thriving because you had this incredible ecosystem of third parties that were all building cool apps on top of Twitter. But then Twitter said to themselves, well, a lot of that data is pretty valuable, and maybe we should be monetizing it ourselves directly. And so over time, they restricted access to the Twitter API. They put rate limits on what you could do. They put total application size limits. And until a couple of years ago, when there was actually a developer revolt as part of, if many of you remember, who remembers app.net and the developer revolt, a couple of people here, they managed to raise $500,000 in 30 days from Twitter developers that were so sick of the structure and the way that Twitter ran their API that they were willing to pay for an alternative that would run directly on subscriptions instead of ad revenue, because the ad revenue model had sort of twisted and perverted all the incentives in the Twitter market to provide that data. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, but I think we could avoid those type of conflicts in the future if the API provider was monetizing directly the use of their API. They weren't just providing it for free to increase the use of their brand or hope that people build things on top of it and build reputational karma, but that they had a way that was really easy and really painless for developers to build on top of it. And so they could encourage, instead of Twitter limiting you to 200,000 calls and basically breaking your app after it reaches that level, that they would want you to get to the level where you were making 100 million calls to their service, because it would be paying for itself. And the developer could be doing this in small enough payments and incrementally enough where they could build it very early on and into their application without a major cost, so that they can still play around and really use those features. So I think that's the big alignment if we really want the API economy to keep growing, is we need to align data providers and those consuming data much more strongly. So just walk you through really quickly how the API network looks right now. Still very much in beta in the early days. Basically has a simple interface where an API or an app can connect to whatever different API sources they want. There's a simple interface where an application can list themselves on the API network. There's a simple interface for building out your application and for end users to actually pull out all of that particular data from the APIs that they're connected to. So I've kind of run through this a little bit quickly, but I really wanted to give us a lot of time to ask questions, really talk about this new approach, and I really enjoy the interactive sort of aspect.
Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.